Good afternoon, colleagues. My name is Volker Hauck. I work with ECDPM and I'm head of the program Security and Resilience. Next to me is Andrew Sherriff. He will introduce himself in a minute. And we both facilitate this webinar, and we do it for the first time with the software. So just for your information, we are seeing our pictures, but we don't see you, but we know that some 10 people, or more than 10 people, are part of the webinar. We just have a technical support who is arranging something, and then I can continue talking. Okay, so this is fixed. While we are speaking, we are getting some more people. The number is more than 10, and it's from different parts of the world. And we have set up this seminar in a way that people with lots of experiences, with medium experiences, but also with no experience in political economy analysis and conflict analysis can catch up, and therefore we have split the program into a more general part, introductory part, followed by some very practical examples presented by Andrew. And Andrew is the person who has most background in conflict analysis. And Andrew, maybe you just can say some words.
Yeah, no, well, thank you, Volker. And it's we don't see you, but it's nice to know that there are people listening on the other end. We know that you have varied experiences, but please, I'm sure some of you have a lot of experience with either conflict or political economy analysis. And we very much hope you'll share that experience, come in, ask us questions and engage. If you have experience, or even if you don't have experience. My own experience is mainly with conflict analysis, and more recently at ECDPM we have been mainstreaming political economy analysis through all the work we do. So I have experience both of conflict analysis and political economy analysis.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. I will now switch to the next slide, which shows that we have split up this webinar into 6 parts, and I will start off with the 4 parts, but we also have a slot where Andrew is commenting or adding some issues to what I say, and vice versa when he starts off with the parts 5 and 6. Please send in your questions, send in your comments. We monitor it on our screen, what's coming in. We also have a support next to us who also can link it up, and then we will try to respond to it to the extent possible right away, or at the question and answers slots right after every section. It is split up into, as you can see, first we briefly touch upon the rationale for conflict analysis. It's also interesting to know where these different analyses come from. So there are different communities. We'll have a word on that. And we'll also build on some work done by colleague of the Volker, which is a Dutch online magazine, where they did a very extensive analysis of more than 80 analysis frameworks. And this also helps to order a little bit this multitude of frameworks, which sometimes might become also a bit confusing to find your way in, and we'll follow up on this with a short highlight on the differences and overlaps when looking at PEAs and conflict analysis frameworks, because even within ECDPM we often have discussions among colleagues of what is really a PEA and what is a conflict analysis, because there are so many things similar, and there are quite a number of similarities as you see, but there are also some differences, and I think it's useful also to highlight this. Andrew will then continue with 2 so-called light touch conflict analysis, share his experience, also his observations, also his dilemmas he encountered based on 2 quite different examples, one from Nigeria working with the EAS and the other one in Bosnia where he also stayed quite extensively previous to his arrival at ECDPM. So this is a time back, but it's still very pertinent in terms of general lessons to be drawn out, and also what have been the advantages, also the trade-offs of this. And at the end, we have a range of questions also to stimulate discussion, also to give you some food for thought on how to put this into practice, and also how to struggle with some of the issues that not you alone, but also others are regularly looking at. So very quickly to focus on the why. Well, these analysis, in principle, if you look at the situations of conflict, fragility, protracted crisis, it can apply, and ideally it should be applied at very different forms of interventions or actions. And it's never linear, which this picture somehow suggests, but there are very different moments where a analysis of a different type, a conflict analysis or PEA or fragility analysis, can be useful. And the phases that are in this picture are of course never strictly one after the other. They very often also go back and forth, as many of you know, which is not a surprise. But finding then a better understanding and a better comprehension of what's going on, such analysis can be very useful. You have a word?
Yeah, no, just to say on that, I think we use political economy analysis, for example, to look at not just developing country context or transitions context, but also the behavior of donors, international community. I was even at a meeting where American agencies, American non-governmentals, were trying to use conflict analysis to understand what's going on in America right now. So these frameworks can be used in many different contexts at many different times to accompany, hopefully, transformational change.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. Now, why is it important? Very often the contexts are quite messy. There is a whole history behind. There are dynamics and power structures. There are various factors leading to change or prohibiting change, and it can help to order all of that, including cultural issues, but also influences from the outside. It can increase also the effectiveness of planning and design, but not only that. It is also, of course, relevant to implementation, to monitoring, to evaluation, and at times it's also used to create a baseline to look at after a couple of months or after some years. And this is notable because donors are increasingly asked to work in these environments that we have just seen in the picture. And there is also a lot of evaluation and learning going on, which then, of course, prompts also the need for adaptation, for changing. In the ideal case, we'll also look what is happening in reality, but this is the idea behind. And this is, of course, then applied to a variety of sectors, also contexts, and it is not only done in the context of the development cooperation or international cooperation, but it is also done by private companies, by the military, by diplomatic actors, and humanitarian assistance. It can be applied very in very different forms, and that also shows the power that can be behind, because there is a lot of interest, of course, to also know what's going on. We move on to conflict sensitivity, but first, Andrew, you have something to say? No,
just to say, I think, it's often an important point to say, why are we doing this, and why is it important? And I think one of the challenges there is we've all read lots of evaluations that says this project, this initiative, this intervention wasn't adapted enough to the context. So ideally, it's a way of operationalizing a more context-specific, context-focused approach that has more chance of success. And I think sometimes when people criticize, or why do political economy analysis or conflict analysis, it's a paper process, it's something that doesn't resonate with the reality of my daily job. It's really about trying to do a better job and to trying to do a more focused and more context-specific reality, to bring that into the types of programming and strategic choices that people like all of us have to make. And it shouldn't be an add-on or a luxury, because if you aren't adapted to context, then chances of things going wrong are pretty high.
Doing conflict analysis, you often then come across the notion of doing it in a sensitive manner. So the whole issue of conflict sensitivity, it's worth to having a brief word about this. And we have just described it very shortly here as the notion of taking into account the positive as well as the negative impact of interventions on conflict, but also what these conflict contexts which are ongoing, that these are also influenced, of course, by these various interventions, and conversely, the impact of these changing contexts on the interventions and what needs to be taken into account. So it's a very iterative process, which goes from two sides. And examples of conflict-sensitive approaches are in the literature. You can find it on the web, the Do No Harm tool, but also resource pack for conflict-sensitive approaches, International Alert, Save a World, and others. They've worked on this since the early 2000s to put it also up online. And it's interesting that now in 2017, we talk about issues that have been very on the top in terms of thinking and creation, but it takes quite some time to bring this also into the practice. The reality, however, is that there is often, weak demand. It depends on where you are working in. There are concerns about the relevance of it in certain quarters. There are also sensitivities. But on the other side, as we also see with this webinar, there is curiosity, also what you can get out of it. And at ECDPM, we see, of course, recently in the last years, more and more demand for these PAs and also forms of conflict analysis. But generally, Andrew, what would you say?
Well, I would say that it's after sort of 19 years of this thinking being around, it's still more often than not, conflict analysis or political economy analysis aren't used. It's striking, and also we've also been involved in several evaluations that even today note the lack of adaptation to context, note the lack of conflict analysis or political economy analysis being undertaken. It's still, unfortunately, quite rare that conflict analysis or political economy analysis is done systematically, at least in our experience. If you have a different experience, then we'd be very glad to hear about that. So in your agency, if they're doing conflict analysis, political economy analysis all the time, in all interventions, please tell us. Maybe you're a best practice case study that we need to look at in more detail. Yeah.
Origins of the PEA and conflict analysis. Different communities have been dealing with this in a way, and there is the whole area of conflict analysis and conflict prevention and peace-building community, which has started to work on this since the early 90s in various contexts. And then, as we said, early 2000s, there were also quite substantive pieces put into the public that were also then spread and were training done, and this was increasingly being used in different contexts. And then the political economy analysis emerging out of the late 90s, early 2000s, also used more from the actors of international cooperation, external action, diplomatic actors, etc. Interesting enough, today both are showing some type of convergence. I also mentioned also some of the discussions we have inside our house from time to time, and there are these overlaps and differences. We will have a separate slide on this, but despite of that, the use of these tools have been rarely a real obligation in certain contexts.
I mean, we often see also that practitioners come from either a sort of governance side where they've been exposed to political economy analysis, or more a peace building, conflict prevention side where they've been exposed to conflict analysis. So political economy analysis on one side, conflict analysis on the other side. They share many similar elements, and the tools we'll look at in more detail. But often practitioners come from either one community or another, or even within donors we often sometimes see competition between the conflict part on one side and the governance part on the other side to promote their own tools, or to champion their own tools one over the other. And I think for us, people who've been exposed to both, we say some analysis is better than none, and we'd much rather the effort was put on doing some analysis than fighting over which is the best tool to use, particularly as some of them contain many similar elements.
Yeah. Andrew, do we have meanwhile any comment or question?
You've all been very quiet so far, so we don't have any comments or questions so far. There will be a space to review this first part before we get into the more how-to questions in the next part.
Okay. Well, this opens now for the third little section of this webinar, and we are drawing here on this review of 88 frameworks, and it is useful also to see to what extent these frameworks that are some in one way or the other that are PAs or conflict analysis frameworks, to what extent they have some generic issues one can use also to order them and to find a little bit the path in the jungle. These were fragility assessments. They looked at benchmark studies, conflict analysis, political economy analysis of various types, capacity assessments. So there is a whole body of knowledge that is out there, developed since the early to mid-90s, if I think back of the capacity assessments that were coming out at this time. And we can divide them into the issue of what structures are they addressing, or structures, or what entities, what also systems or frameworks. The second one is the level of analysis. Where do they focus on? And then, of course, very often the contextual elements. They are one of the first things one wants to look at. And finally, the analytical focus. I'll start with the structures. We are talking here about entities or issues that, if we say it very lightly, order our world. Political systems or forms of governance. Sectors, quite often used entity for a political analysis, certainly in the context of sectoral planning, or also understanding how particular actors within a sector tick and function, what the interests are, etc. The social-cultural norms is another domain, as well as networks and movements, but finally also policy frameworks. And a colleague of us, or several colleagues of us at ECDPM, they have done fairly recently a political economy analysis of the Cotonou Agreement,
which is an agreement between the EU and Africa, Caribbean and Pacific countries.
Which was a quite sensitive exercise. But just for your information, the documents can be found on our website. Second one are the different levels of analysis. And one can apply it to, of course, the global level, the regional level, the national level or the local level, or also different levels that interact with each other. But interesting enough, from this analysis of these 88 context analysis frameworks, and a majority focuses on the national one. Conflicts, however, have very often the characteristic of going across borders. So knowing what's going on in the region, very relevant. But also, it's of course important to understand what influences there are from the global level. So it's these different levels that this is our view, one should try to the extent possible to systematically take into account, while very well noting that a lot of dynamics at the very local level, they are very difficult also to capture. Certainly if you have a limited time. These are the how questions, but just to let you know that there are pros and cons on this.
Yeah, and just to say on my analysis of political economy frameworks, just the brief ones that I've used, I've noticed that most of them haven't really focused that much on the regional level, or it's bunched in with other externalities. Whereas given what we know about conflict, regional conflict systems now, whether you're talking from the Sahel to the Middle East to the Andean region to the Balkans in the past, most conflict analysis frameworks that I'm aware of have a good and strong perspective on the regional, that political economy analysis frameworks that I've been exposed to tend to downplay a bit, or they don't have so much space on theirs. We're trying to redress that balance at ECDPM by focusing quite a lot on political economy analysis of regional organizations and at the regional level. And if you're interested in that material is also available on our website.
Let's look at the third one, which are the contextual elements. And they are very prominent throughout the different frameworks. When doing such a political economy analysis or a conflict analysis, it's very useful to first look at the foundational factors. Yeah. What is the history? What are the facts? Do we have also the statistics to understand, in the first one, the elements that are really there, that are very much determining and a situation which are also easily to understand from the factual side. Then the actors, a variety of actors, civil society, government, also actors being together in forms of associations or certain elite groups, certain interest groups. And the third one is the formal institutions, the regulations, the formal institutions, and finally the informal institutions, including norms and values, also understanding what comes out of religion or certain ideology, etc. So these are the four subcategories here, and doing them at the different levels that we just saw gives a rich information if you systematically try to do all of these four for each of these levels. It's also a lot of work. Yeah. It's a lot of work, but once you do it systematically, you get you really get a full matrix in a way, with information that gives you a very, very first sight information into these contextual situations.
And I would just say that we'll come back to this when we look at the case studies, but there is never enough time to do the type of analysis in the type of depth that you would like to do. And it's the same for conflict analysis or political economy analysis. So it really is a challenge to do that, and we'll talk more in detail about that.
There is a comment.
Okay,
there is a question to better understand why we distinguish structures and contexts. The structures, if we go back, oh, sorry. The structures, these are the entities that we had distinguished here, where you can apply political analysis or conflict analysis to. It is different from the from the context as such. I mean, the sectors or sector you analyze takes place in a certain context.
Yeah.
Also, the discussions about a policy framework takes place in a certain context, in a policy dialogue context. But this list here lines out the different type of issues and entities you can apply a political analysis to. Maybe you have additional words. So it's a way of ordering these different analysis tools, and the other elements have been here, the different levels of doing the analysis, and also the different contextual elements that are within this analysis to better understand the context. The fourth one is the analytical focus, and the assessment frameworks that have been researched. They distinguishes between a more power-focused or more indicator-focused or more narrative-focused analysis. And power-focused, the way how power is exercised, very much focusing on interests and groups with particular agendas. Also how the relations are between different groups, different actors, how they also determine a particular contextual situation over time or at a particular moment. Examples are the UK's drivers of change, also the 5 lenses that we will present in a minute from ECDPM is also there. And the indicator focused is to compare more the context based on certain indicators. I mentioned also baseline studies, which can be done over time to better get the factual information of changes over time. The World Bank governance indicator is one of these. And finally, we have the narrative-focused ones, which more provide in-depth information. Also, of course, used for the local level to provide qualitative analysis, and USAID conflict assessment is an example. But what we also see in reality is that these 3 different foci, they are also getting very much into one analysis. The distinction is made here because certain of these frameworks that have been analyzed tend to go more into a more power-focused one. Others are more indicator-focused. Others are more narrative-focused. And if you do a political economy analysis or conflict analysis, use to the extent possible what information you can get from the other areas, because then you also see the richness of or understand the richness of the context you're in.
Yeah, I think there is perhaps one of the big takeaways in my experience when I started being involved in conflict analysis at the beginning, which was sometimes people would pull out existing analyses like an indicator-based analysis or a rather bland context analysis written up and say, this is a conflict analysis, or this is a political economy analysis, or is this what you mean by a political economy analysis? And unless it has those three elements to it, and at least on the indicators side that it is somewhat drawing on that knowledge, then I think the analysis has certain blind spots, and the best analyses combine these factors and don't rely too much on standing only on one aspect of them. And certainly, I would say some of the indicator-based work is information to go into a conflict analysis or a political economy analysis, but on its own has limitations in telling you about what's really going on in the context.
What we also can take away from this is that, generally speaking, a conflict analysis or a political economy analysis, very much in the term itself already, appears to be power focused. But don't forget that there is a whole richness you can also draw on if you look more at indicators and certain studies, and also narratives to complement your view. And you can very much use indicators to start with to get a sense of a certain situation, and also narratives to complement your views that you have obtained by doing a power analysis.
Yeah. Before we move on, I'll come back to this in the examples, but one of the first things I do when I'm asked to do a conflict analysis, and more recently a political economy analysis, is basically I look for what existing conflict analysis and political economy analysis are out there, to see what, mostly in the public domain available, if it's Bosnia or northern Nigeria or whatever, actually starting off by looking at what's already available in terms of analytical frameworks that are out there really helps jumpstart your process. There is confirmation bias in there that we have to take care of, but it really, starting with what's out there is, to me, one of the things that I've learned to move quicker, because we never have enough time to do the analysis that we'd really like to do in the depth we do. And in many instances, some analysis already exists.
Okay. Just a short point. A participant has a problem to hear us. So if there are others who have problems to hear us, we have assistance here. So we'll take care of that. Okay, thanks. Let us go to the fourth subsection here to look briefly at differences and overlaps. And we use the so-called 5-lens PEA framework that colleagues have developed here at ECDPM. We have quite extensively worked with it, both Andrew and I as well, and then also look at the EU's conflict analysis framework. So also to see a little bit where does the one put the weight on, where does the other one.
And just to say,
we also do a bit of a comparison between these two.
Just to say that both this PEA analysis framework that we use and the EU conflict analysis framework, to me, they hold many similar elements to other tools that you may be using in your own agencies. So we've chosen these not because they are just ones that we are familiar with, but ones we think have many similar elements to other conflict analyses that are used in donor agencies. Maybe not exactly the same, but hopefully enough similarities that you'll recognize them in the tools you have for yourselves.
Good. These two bullets here just capture what we briefly said. Tested in various ECDPM studies. I also referred earlier to the analysis of a policy framework, the Cotonou Agreement, also to country studies, and also to regional organizations. It's more of a power and interest focused framework, whereby we not only look at the country level, but also at the regional level, and also undertake a more structured analysis. It builds on a number of well-known other frameworks from the World Bank, the problem-driven political economy analysis, the international drivers of corruption at the OECD, but also on work that focuses more on the service delivery level, more at the sectoral level. So there are a variety of frameworks which have been studied and where then we are drawing on. And this has resulted in the so-called 5 lenses that you see on the left side, where starting off, not surprisingly, looking at the structural and foundational factors, the formal and the informal institutions or rules of the games. You recognize here, of course, some of these elements that we also drew on from the study of 88 frameworks. The actors, agency, incentives. The third one also sector-specific technical and political characteristics. Quite relevant also to look at some technical issues that might determine at a certain moment or to a certain extent also the political situation and the context situation or influences. And then finally, external or exogenous factors, regional or global. And we found this absolutely necessary to get also better understanding in certain regions how countries that historically have very close ties are interacting, also influencing each other, and looking at the conflict or protracted crisis situation in many countries. Of course, this is not a surprise, but keep this in mind as a relevant one. There is a document here on our website. We have put here the URL next to it, and this is a reference document that goes a bit in detail.
Yeah. And we've started to use those 5 lenses on a number of regional organizations and regional entities in Africa. You can find some of the details of that work on our website, and there'll be more information on it, applying it, looking at things like the Nile River Basin Organization, like EGAD in the Horn of Africa, understanding of what is the real political economy and drivers of these institutions. And it comes up with some fairly stark and difficult messages as well for also donors' engagements in these environments in terms of what can be expected given the political economy factors we find in these situations. And to our knowledge, there hasn't been very much work done about at the regional level on political economy and what drives or holds back change or results from regional organizations. It is quite sensitive, some of that work. We only use public material in the public domain and interviews to do the analysis, but it comes out with some things that are perhaps people will talk about, but see less down on paper in such direct terms about countries' interests, about sectors' interests, about the role of donor organizations in financing and therefore setting agendas in these organizations that perhaps are not sufficiently bought into because the political economy isn't right by the organizations themselves.
Yeah. As the next one, the conflict analysis guidance from the EU side, and some time back Andrew had a little hand in this one, but maybe we have also a participant from the EAS.
Yeah.
Please come in and
or the
share
European
your views.
Commission,
also how this has been used. Very, very important here that in the context of more comprehensive work between the Commission and the EAS, the European External Action Service, on how to work on fragility, also dealing with conflict. This is a guide which has been produced jointly, and it has been, of course, part of quite a process of exchange, and it was then in the end a product that built, of course, also on quite some international knowledge. We referred to the work of International Alert and Save a World earlier, this resource pack, and this itself, of course, drew on other work. And there was some exchange between conflict analysis and also having an eye on political economy analysis, so it was not exclusively, but it resulted in a guidance note that helps also to better understand post-conflict or conflict settings and to further strengthen the EU's comprehensive approach, and what is also called today the integral approach, integrated approach, and it departed as well, puts a very important also note on the conflict sensitivity in doing it to better understand transformation processes.
Just to add some things on that, there was an evaluation done in 2011 of the EU's approach to conflict prevention and peace building, and one of the focuses of that evaluation was conflict analysis. And what we discovered, I was on the evaluation team, is surprise, surprise, not many conflict analyses were done. And then when we talked to officials, they said, well, I think we have something called a checklist for the root causes of conflict somewhere. I heard about it a few years ago, but there was no agreed framework for conflict analysis, and that was a missing gap. And in the evaluation, we were quite tough and quite hard on the European institutions and said, well, if you're really serious about this, you need to have your own framework. It needs to be endorsed. It needs to be something that is shared across the different services of the EU, and it needs to be something that will help you operationalize a better approach to dealing with conflict. So it was a strong message that came from an evaluation. It was picked up by new parts of the European External Action Service that had just been created, and parts of the European Commission to develop this analysis framework in 2012. So there was some demand, but I think generally I would say having a tool that is somewhat endorsed, formally endorsed, is helpful in taking forward either conflict analysis or political economy analysis. I have to say, again, speaking sort of frankly and off the record, there was a bit of competition at the time between conflict analysis and political economy analysis, as two different parts of the European institutions were promoting different tools and different ways of working. And that, I think, is something that also happens. It's not just the EU where that happens, it's happened in other instances as well. In the end of the day, the conflict analysis guidance note also refers to the importance of political economy analysis and using those resources as well.
I've just highlighted the link where you can find this, and when you read it through, you'll see a couple of elements that are very familiar from our discussion so far. Analysis of the context, of course, the issues, also where there are conflict-prone areas, where there are safe areas, causes of conflict, structural aspects, also triggers, also those elements that are promoting conflict, others that are working against it, the actors, their interests, we had this before, and then quite interesting here, the conflict dynamics, also the interactions.
Which is the essential part.
Which is really also a very combined work, looking at the context on one side, but also the causes and the actors, how this links together, how this also mixes in a way so that a particular situation comes out of it. So these dynamics are relevant. And of course, one can say a political economy analysis also should look at certain dynamics. But this issue of a conflict dynamic analysis, it comes very much from this school of thinking as well.
But I think, and to me, it's really best practice in conflict analysis. If you just look at if you don't look at the interaction and ongoing dynamics and evolution of the dynamics, you really get a very poor picture of what is going on in a context.
Part of the guidance also asks then the ones using it to line out possible future scenarios, also options for engagement, and also identification of what could not be researched, what could not be understood, because this is important, because otherwise one might think that one has a full picture of everything, but there are always areas that need further research, or where one, just because of the lack of information, needs to be extremely cautious in what to draw from that. And that is, I think, is also very well written down in this conflict analysis guidance. If we do a bit of a comparison, starting with the first two bullets, both have a power incentive focus. Of course, can be combined with what we said earlier, this narrative and qualitative focus and quantitative focus. Both analyze structural factors, the actors, how the context evolves, the incentives of the actors, what is formal, informal in terms of institutions in this context. Now, looking a little bit at where they differ, possibly, is conflict analysis has really a strong focus on what's going on in terms of tensions, conflicts, violent conflicts, fragility, the dynamics we referred to just when we talked about the earlier slide. PEA traditionally, where it comes from, originally more grounded in the analysis of more stable or development type contexts. To a certain extent, it's just where it's coming from in terms of community and practitioners. But this conflict sensitivity is also a more distinguishing factor. This has been, for example, when we talk here with colleagues in the House, the conflict sensitivity is not upfront among them, those who are dealing with political economy analysis. Huh? So it's quite a distinguishing factors. But we see in reality more and more convergence of both, also application of gradual application of conflict sensitive PEAs. I think this is a nice term when we talk about these frameworks that try to integrate, and it makes sense. Huh? It makes really sense, because we are really talking also in the context of more stable situations or seemingly stable situations, that there are forms of conflict or tensions or really opposing fractions within a certain situation that are also the base for possible conflict in the future. Yeah. So one should not underestimate that.
And we shouldn't underestimate for things like if you looked at most indexes of fragility and peace and conflict before the Arab Spring, pretty much none of those countries in northern Africa were on those lists. Nowadays they are often near the top of those lists. So having said that, there were some analyses going around at the time saying that there was some very deep structural factors going on in North Africa that were likely, if left unaddressed, to lead to significant conflict. This was not the norm, and I don't think many people got very far in applying conflict analysis at the time, if they wanted to do, prior to the Arab Spring in 2011.
Andrew, there was just a question coming in through Andrea. Should conflict analysis be part of PEA or the other way around, or are the two separate analysis?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I mean, my perspective on that is start with what you've got. So if you have a conflict analysis or political economy analysis, do not think you have to start with a blank page. I think then it's looking at what you have and saying, what does this not cover for what purpose? And I would say that if you already have a conflict analysis or political economy analysis, it's a question of building onto it rather than starting with a blank sheet, and that is to be a pragmatic thing to do. And that's what I've done when I've done conflict analyses in the past. I've very much looked and drawn on political economy analysis that has been used. If you have nothing, so you neither have a conflict analysis or a political economy analysis, I think it's also a question, and we'll come back to it when we look at the examples, is if I'm really about change, what framework helps me promote change in the organizations that I'm working? What one is going to have more resonance? And then what way do I have to use it? What little additions do I need to do it to make it either a more conflict-sensitive political economy analysis or more a conflict analysis informed by political economy approaches? But I really, my one message there is, please don't get into a into a fight over which framework to use. Some analysis is better than none, and unfortunately, I see in many instances that is not a problem of we have too much analysis, it's we don't have any analysis at the moment. Having said that, what I do think is often there are critical moments. If there is a critical moment in terms of significant change in the context or an outbreak of violence, it may often at that moment, that when things become violent, that you go back to either, if you have a political economy analysis, and say, what didn't we see? What do we need to update this analysis from? Or how have things changed that we have to apply that additional analytical, conflict analytical lens to the political economy that we have done? But the main message is some analysis better than the other, and build on what you have to be pragmatic in an environment where none of us have enough time.
Let me add to this, also in response to the question whether they should be approached separately. You get much more out of it if you open your perspective and try also to integrate the best of all. And you are working in institutions, and you might have a certain framework, you might have a certain guidance. Take the example of a political economy analysis, and you also can deepen your analysis by adding a conflict sensitivity to it. Also to see to what extent certain questions you have within your guidance might be complemented with questions that relate more to conflicts or possible conflicts, and also relate to the whole question, hold on, if I do this type of intervention, what consequences might it have on the conflict situation or the political economy situation? Whom do I strengthen? Whom do I weaken? What type of influence do we have together with others? All these questions, they come up. So it would be, as Andrew said, from our perspective, wrong to treat it dogmatically.
Yeah.
And very much look from what you have, and also what you can take from both sides to get the best out of it.
Yeah, I think also you will get greater buy-in from your peers and colleagues if you build on what's existing there. I think there is a limited threshold or tolerance, and I actually have seen this where didn't we have a political economy analysis 6 months ago, and now there's another team coming back to do a conflict analysis. Didn't we just have these asking similar questions? If you can show how it's built on or an addition, and how it's respectful of the knowledge and the time that was taken to generate that, you generally have greater buy-in for the follow-up and engagement in actually using the analysis, which is really what this is all about. This isn't an academic exercise. This is about changing behavior and using analysis to make better informed decisions.
This little discussion already brings us to the next slide, which is the last one of the first more introductory part before we move on to the concrete examples. And there are, of course, many who, when, and how questions. You see here on the slide a selection of those. And when you are within an institution, questions arise. What is the purpose of this exercise, and who should work with it, who should initiate it, also who should take care that it is used. Also, when, at which moment of a intervention you are best advised to do this, and there can be very different reasons. More at the beginning, or more at the end, or more during a monitoring phase. Also, how to do it. Should it be more light or more in depth? Of course, the resources are always an issue. The timing. Should it be done by internal people? Is it so sensitive that you need to watch out that you are not in the risk of having information spread outside your organization that might also have impact on the whole reputation of your organization? Dissemination questions are related to that, to what extent it goes more internal, external. And if you download this conflict analysis guidance from the EU, you see that a distinction is made between so-called light touch conflict analysis and also more in-depth, longer conflict-sensitive PA, which might include much longer engagement. But the examples which Andrew will highlight are in the domain of light touch, so-called light touch. But within the light touch, you can really have a light touch, or you can have a more intense light touch. So there are various forms. This matrix here suggests a couple of questions you want to take into account. It's not complete, and there are really benefits and trade-offs in whatever direction you take. And with this, maybe we just then look at the response box, whether there is anything else, because we are coming to the end here. If not, we would then go on to the Bosnia case, but we just wait a moment, because you understand that it takes a couple of seconds until it comes in.
Yeah. So essentially what we're asking from here, is there anything that you didn't hear that you would have liked to have heard on the conceptual side of things, on the things that perhaps maybe weren't clear, things that you'd like more information on, if you have experience to share, if your experience is completely different from what we've laid out, then we would very much like to hear from you. We'll give you a bit of time on that, and then we'll move to the next session, which is really focusing on the how, looking at some very concrete examples, because I think what we're all here to do is see how this can change our practice, can be actually applied. And one of the best ways to explore that is to look at, in my mind, 2 concrete experiences that show how analysis led to some degree of change and why that was the case.
As the one moderating this 2-hour session, we are approaching the end of the first hour, and there are 2 cases, so we have to see to what extent this fits within the time given. Maybe, Andrew, I give you now the word on the Bosnia one.
Yeah.
Then you can start and keep in mind the time.
So essentially, this was what I'm going to do is look at 2 light touch experiences and look at the experience dilemmas and trade-offs, and these are experiences from the real world. They are very much, you'll see in red, personal reflections. Both of these processes I was involved as an independent facilitator. I'm sure if you went and talked to the people involved in them, they may have quite a different narrative about exactly what happened and why it happened. But it's to really try and ground, how is analysis actually used? What has it actually led to? We've all seen the tools, the frameworks that exist, but when they're actually used, what happens? So basically, I will look at some of the sort of cross-cutting issues that occur in these 2 case studies, although we'll probably focus mainly on the first one, which is things like, what were the drivers for actually doing a conflict analysis in the first place? Because it's often that's the starting point, not how good your analytical framework is or whether it should be conflict analysis or political economy analysis, but who's asking for this, who's wanting it, what are the drivers, and what are frankly, what are the potential spoilers? I think I can be quite frank and say there's a lot of people who don't believe in analysis, or who believe that there are other things that are more important and should be prioritized more. We'll look a bit at the conflict, the context in the 2 examples, Bosnia and Northern Nigeria. I'll also explain why conflict analysis and political economy analysis for these 2 examples. And I'll explain a bit about who was involved. And then I'll speculate a bit on, did this lead to change? Did analysis lead to to a transformation of behavior. And then some common dilemmas we'll focus in the last session. And these are also dilemmas that have come to us not only from these two examples, but also speaking to colleagues who've done political economy analysis, including within donor agencies as well. So these are really common dilemmas that are not specific to light touch conflict analysis, not specific to these particular contexts, but come up when you're applying analysis. I'm going to start by explaining a little bit about what the circumstance was in this example relates to the United Kingdom, and it relates to them going from a process of essentially having really no conflict analysis and no strategy and priorities, but essentially a collection of projects. So what happened, you see in the bottom of the slide there, is essentially you had a bunch of projects that were supposed to contribute to conflict prevention in Bosnia. 2006, this was 11 years after the end of the war in Bosnia, but essentially there was no strategy or priorities guiding them, and there was certainly no conflict analysis guiding them. That's what you had prior to 2006. So you had a bunch of money, a pool of money that people were dipping into, and for the most part the officials were quite happy because they could do what they wanted with the resources, and they could run projects that they felt were important to them, fitted their institutional strategies and institutional priorities. What happened was, though, there was basically an evaluation and some fairly tough questions that were asked about how do we know these activities are related to conflict prevention, and how do we know that they are strategically focused. And these questions were asked from London, and they were also asked by the DFID head of office and also by the ambassador. So questions were beginning to be asked about how do we know what we're doing is strategic? How do we know what we're doing is related to actually conflict prevention, other than us just thinking it's a good idea and packaging it as such? What happened after that was they realized that they wanted to do a conflict analysis, but they didn't have the skill set available locally in Bosnia to do so. They didn't have a framework for conflict analysis. They didn't have a framework they didn't have anyone who was beyond the three departments concerned who had expertise in that. And therefore they thought they needed to bring in someone from outside to actually help facilitate a process of conflict analysis that would then lead to a new strategy and new guidelines for actually supporting activities for conflict prevention. So I was the lucky one who was chosen to be appointed. Lucky to be there at the right time, right place, rather than them, I think, extensively scouring the planet for the best person. But I had experience in conflict analysis and I was available. The first thing I did before deciding what framework of analysis to use or what the purpose was essentially to meet the different stakeholders who would be both involved in this analysis and involved in implementing what came out of it, to really consult them on what would be the best process and what would be the best way of approaching this. And really some things came out of that were fairly keen. Sorry, it says at the top that it was 2016, actually it was 2006, so it's long enough ago that I can talk quite frankly about it. Essentially, what came out of that process was a lot of people were scared that their projects were going to be cut. If we have a new strategy, maybe the projects that we do will be cut. They were afraid that they would be caught up in long process of analyses when they had limited time. And they were afraid that a very, very long document that would come out of this process that wouldn't actually give them strategic guidance on what to do and what not to do. So we had to balance all of those concerns and design a process that met those needs. And if we hadn't done that at the start, I may have gone for a much more in-depth conflict analysis process. But I think it would have not really been what people wanted, what people were ready for, and what would have actually led to change.
So Andrew, what you say is, in order to do this conflict analysis, you had to do a very thorough analysis of the donor context and of the interests and also the preferences, the sensitivities. It's a two-way thing, huh?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I've seen enough analyses fall at the first hurdle because they haven't figured out, almost to use the phrase, the political economy of what's going inside the donor agency in terms of where pressures, vested interests, etc. lie, and to design a process that somewhat can navigate that. Basically, then once we'd had that, we what came clear on that was we needed a framework for conflict analysis, but the frameworks that I had, which was basically the DFID strategic conflict assessment framework from that time, really was too complicated to run a facilitated session with the different parties. So I basically simplified that framework, which did involve in some trade-offs, and I want to come back to those. And then ran the first conflict analysis session with basically not only the expat staff, but also the local staff who had some of the best knowledge on the conflict context. And this was also legitimized by, not for the whole day, but participation of the ambassador as well. So I had very high level buy-in from the head of the DFID office, from the ambassador, and from the most senior, the defense attaché in this process. So buy-in and interest, and I tried to make it as fun and interesting as possible. So that first session happened. That took not a full day, but 2/3 of a day to do. I then wrote up that. We had sort of flip charts, and it was a kind of sort of quite an interactive process against a framework coming from the DFID conflict assessment. We then had a second conflict analysis session, which kind of went from the general to prioritizing areas that people felt were essential for conflict prevention in Bosnia. Not to the point of what the UK should do in the second one, but more what people, what was the prevailing feeling from the analysis that we had in the first session about how we could group and prioritize areas. And then the third session was really on developing a strategy from the analysis. So we have the analysis. What things are we really going to prioritize? What are the themes coming out from this that in our conflict prevention strategy are linked to the analysis? And again, that was about a day, not a full day. It was sort of a 10 till 3 kind of thing. And that ended up with a draft analysis and strategy and priority areas all in one document, which again was something that people said at the very start. We don't want the analysis as a standalone. We want it to help be a strategy and lead to a strategy and lead to priority areas. This was all done in country in Bosnia amongst the local staff of the embassy and the internationals, the British staff of the embassy. It then had to go back to London, the headquarters, for comment on the priorities and themes, because they too had their priorities for conflict prevention, not only for the Balkans but for globally, the global conflict prevention pool, as it was called at the time. And then once we got those comment back, we had a finalized document. And
just a question, because you talk about these 3 sessions.
Yeah.
Were these 3 sessions part of a certain guidance on how to do conflict analysis, or did you decide in the process that not only one but a second and then also a third session was needed to do this? How did this evolve? Was there also the flexibility there to do this, or was it fairly set out from the beginning, also in the terms of reference?
No, this was very much, the terms of reference were quite loose on this because they hadn't done it before. This is 2006, remember, so I think the UK has moved on since then, so there wasn't any guidance on how to do it. What I felt was people were all busy. getting them all together in a room was very difficult. So they didn't actually want to spend, as much as they thought this was important. There was a limited amount of time they could spend it on. So I pushed it to what I thought was the maximum I could get, because I wanted them not only to have to participate in the analysis, bring their knowledge and perspective. Obviously, the defence person has different knowledge and perspective from the DFID and the Foreign Office people there. But really, 3 was the minimum necessary. And even then, I feel, as a social scientist, not so happy with the depth of the analysis we could get to in only 3 sessions. So that's what I said, although I think in some sections I was lucky about that. If I go to step 8, basically what happened there was essentially they realized that having the strategy and the analysis, they now needed to administer it. And this couldn't be done by just one person. It had to be done by the different departments that were present on the ground. So they formed a committee under the chairmanship of the deputy head of mission, so the deputy ambassador, who sort of oversaw it. So that was the first process. And basically from stage 1 to stage 8 was about 2.5 months. But the actual contact, FaceTime with the people involved was probably about 3.5, 4 days in total. And it wasn't full days, so people could do their other things at the beginning and start of the day as well. So that was the process of doing that. And then at the end of the after 8, we actually already narrowed it down into 2 areas, and I'll explain those 2 areas in the next slide. But we then felt we wanted to deepen the analysis further and get some buy-in and validation, and we did some civil society consultation as well on the analysis, where again we took as a starting point the priority areas that we'd identified, the 2 priority areas that we'd identified through the analysis process, and then we unpacked those again with more analysis through 2 civil society one-day consultations. And when I say civil society, many of these people were experts in their fields, whether it was corruption, reconciliation, security sector reform. And after that process, we then had a call for proposals, because there were some things that we wanted local partners to actually implement. And we had a call for proposals that was also designed and linked into the analysis that we had and to the strategy that we had. So there was a real follow through to deciding on what the UK was going to fund in particular instances, from the analysis through the strategy, through the consultation, through to the call for proposals.
This slide is very much about the process.
Yeah.
No? So not so far. So what is then coming out of it? We'll have this in the next slide. Maybe there are some questions about the process as such, done in a situation where the donor itself was quite intensely involved, also in terms of strategic thinking, high-level involvement. Maybe some reflections from participants on their own situation or questions coming from that.
Yeah, well, if you have those questions, please
feed them in, and then while going on, we will respond to them.
I mean, I think I will say later on as well, what I was very lucky in this process was having the high-level buy-in and recognition that change needed to happen, and that conflict analysis could help with that change. And that is not always the case. I think we've all been in situations whereby we're the ones trying to push conflict analysis, but the buy-in is not always there. So it's a bit atypical, at least in my experience, for how conflict analysis is used.
Well, what is also interesting is that you put this more in the category of a light touch analysis, while the process is quite intense. Also, the level of engagement is quite diverse. Foreign Office, DFID, defense, etc., etc.
Yeah.
So that is the example where I said before you can have a more intense light touch.
Yeah.
You also can have a light touch.
Yeah.
So what is the reason you put it here in this light touch category?
I think it's the light touch category because for me the depth of the analysis you can get to in 3 sessions, and the fact that it wasn't a piece of research that I went around and interviewed people, those things are something that leads to real in-depth conflict analysis that is maybe a 3 or 4 month period of research that is led to good social scientific standards, that involves a large literature review, that involves interviews with 40 people, that triangulates information from outside. That I would consider as a more in-depth analysis, where the information and analytical perspectives very much relied on the people in the room. And I think that was good because it had buy-in, but it is also, again, as a social scientist, I have certain questions on confirmation bias, on people speaking from their own perspective, what they know, rather than something that is more in-depth. And I think there were some blind spots in that analysis because it wasn't as comprehensive as if we'd followed through. That's why I consider it light touch, even if the process was quite significant.
Just hold on, there was just a question here. In case you do not have a general buy-in for conflict analysis or PEA, what would you recommend us to do? I mean, this is absolutely crucial question.
Yeah.
It's also when you are obliged to do something because of a certain routine, but if there is no real interest behind, what to do?
Yeah, I think it's very much showing how, and I had to do it with this process as well, how this can help people do their jobs better and is not going to be a thief of time from other things. So you have to be a bit of a salesperson for why it is useful and relevant. I also think that you have to look for windows of opportunity, and again here a new strategy process, a new country director, a big change in the context. I had a friend, for example, who was trying desperately to do a conflict analysis and getting no buy-in, and then a big major conflict happened in the country, and suddenly everyone was asking her, where's that conflict analysis you were working on? And they were the same people who wouldn't give her 2 minutes the month before to actually answer an interview. So I think you have to look for windows of opportunity and build alliances to do that. That's really my only advice. I think it's very hard to do it if you meet resistance from every level. So it has to be, you have to try and articulate it in a way that helps people do their job, and look for windows of opportunity either in the changing of the political context that makes people think, hang on a minute, what's going on here? And if you can say, well, let's have a look at what's going on here in more detail. Might be a change of government, might be a significant violent instance. It might be getting into a new sector of engagement where you were less familiar with in the past. Those kind of things can help. And then also if you have new people coming in who perhaps are want to try something new, or perhaps less familiar with the context and want to see a baseline that's a bit more objective than just the colleagues already who are there in post telling them how the situation is. I think you have to get creative and look for those windows of opportunity.
Now, in response to this question, I think it's also important to distinguish between a situation, and you are working within organizational contexts, whether doing a conflict analysis is part of the policy or the objectives of your organization, whether you are really also stimulated to do this, or whether there is any kind of document that has been set out where you are reminded of doing it, or whether you want to do it just out of your own initiative. So when this is part of an organizational context, a policy or guidance, also terms of references, whatever, then make use of this also to bring your views on why this is important home. Otherwise, you just do not make use of this opportunity.
Yeah.
But I think it's useful to make this distinction. And then if there is a reference you can use why this should be done, then indeed go and do the lobbying, do the convincing. Also look for also your colleagues who are on the same line, on the same wavelength than you, and get them together to also make the case for it, and then also to bring it to higher levels.
Yeah, I have to say, I mean, I'm jumping a little bit ahead of what I will say later. I don't want to depress anyone, but I would say that the successful conflict analyses or analyses that I have been aware of, there has been a champion. There has been someone who is of sufficient level within the organization and who wants it. And that's when things have happened. I find it much more difficult. And I think I've heard many stories of people finding it difficult without the champion. And they may have very different reasons for why they want that analysis, but that champion really, really makes things happen.
Let's look at the results of this one.
Yeah. So essentially, I will talk a little bit about what came out of the analysis, and I'll try and summarize that. This was the conflict analysis we did. So essentially, we had 5 areas. You can see two in red, and then 3 below in black. The 2 in red were the ones that we chose to prioritize and focus on in the strategy after doing the analysis. And these were, looking at the power dynamics, this was really an analysis of the conflict dynamics, I would say, that were there. So there was more analysis behind why the state was weak, or why the political culture reinforces rather than challenges the divisions and attitudes that led to conflict in the past. And there was a real interest to say, okay, we have these 5 areas, we can all agree on them. What I also tried to do was very much structure the analysis beforehand so that the defense, the development, and the political people from the foreign ministry couldn't fall back into their comfort zones of, well, this is a security matter, this is a political matter, or this is a development matter, and show how these things were all mixed and interrelated. That also helped with the take-up. So once we had these 5 areas, how did we get to the 2 priority areas? And there again, it was a very much a pragmatic choice against other criteria. And you can see the criteria at the bottom of the page there, in the sense that in prioritizing where to put the focus of the UK in these 5 areas, they looked at themselves. They looked at their analysis, they looked at where they were in terms of actually the pot of money that was for conflict prevention in Bosnia was relatively small from the UK. So they don't have a lot of money to spend on these things. So where can they get the most bang for the money they had? So, actually trying to address the weakness of the economy with a small fund was thought to be a relatively, you don't have the resources to do that. They also were looking at, what are other people doing? Are there other donors or actors who are already quite active in some of these areas, such as reconciliation, critical issues on the past? And again, there were. There was an overarching review of the UK Global Conflict Prevention Fund, which also provided some analysis on what areas to engage in and what areas not to. Also, on some of these areas, such as actually on weakness of the economy and economic marginalisation, DFID had a big other fund to address this. So the value add of these resources and of the conflict prevention strategy was limited. And then there was what kind of capacity that the embassy had at headquarters level, and whether the UK government had a comparative advantage. And this filter also helped get buy-in to the analysis. We've done our analysis, now we're going to do something with it, but we also have to do a reality check. The analysis in itself doesn't lead us to our strategic choices without reflecting a bit on ourselves. And that's how we ended up with those two priority areas at the end, and really how they were owned by the group.
Yeah. Did you have an opportunity also to look at this after some time, like after a year? What has come out of it? Did you have the luxury?
No, I unfortunately I stayed for a few months after this process, and then I left. But I kept in contact with some of the people, and actually this whole example was then used about 2 years later when they were looking for good practice across the region. And there informally I met many of the people involved in the process. Some of them had changed, the local staff had remained. And the local staff actually were interesting. What they really got out of the process is they really enjoyed being part of the analysis process, but they also enjoyed the prioritization, because they were coming under a lot of pressure through, why aren't you funding this, why aren't you supporting that? And they now had the ability to say, because this relates to conflict, we should be funding this, was sometimes what they were getting from outside parties, where they could say, well, it doesn't fit our strategic priorities. So there was some reflection on this being a good way of going about things, and the committee was still there 2 years later, and the process was seen to have led to change and follow up. They should be doing the analysis regularly. I was brought in as an external facilitator, really because they had capacity constraint, but the UK government now, for example, DFID has 60 trained conflict advisors, so that they don't need to bring in people from the outside very often these days. Back then they probably had about 20. So it's, over the last 11 years things have moved on a bit.
Not each organization has that.
No.
And
no.
that brings me to a point not specific to these analysis, but more a generic point, because of staff rotation.
Yeah.
And when doing a conflict analysis, this is the tip, look also into the archives to see whether anything has been done before. Because institutional memory is sometimes thin, but the paper is patient and is somewhere in the archive. So also try to look back and find out whether anything has been done that could be useful for your plans to have a conflict analysis or to do one. Precisely because very precious bits of information might be there somewhere that have been undug in the past.
Yeah. And just to say, I looked at the process. One of the things I did in this process, which was to even though it was light touch, was to again collect and look at the existing analysis that was there, available in Bosnia, both political economy analysis and conflict analysis, for which there were a few, and there was some sector analysis and things, and that really helped me. I would have struggled, and I would have been even more nervous about the light touch if I hadn't had that to fall back on.
Good.
Yeah.
Let us just...
that was just to highlight those. Okay.
Question answer. There was still a question here. I'm just wondering, it was an earlier question by Andrea. This one we had, the last one, if you don't buy in, but I'm just wondering, as you are saying that PEA and conflict analysis are converging, would you have done a PEA similarly? I'm not sure I fully understand the question.
Is that relating
this
to
relates
this,
to the earlier part?
This relates to the example, or would I have if I was doing a political economy analysis, would I have chosen the same process as I chose for the conflict analysis? I think if that's what I understand by the question, that it was the conflict that I did, the example I showed was of a conflict analysis, and therefore I think it was right to bring in and necessary to bring in the defence parts and the of the embassy. Would I do that for a political economy analysis? Perhaps not always, but the rest of the process, I would think I would do something relatively similar to what was done, provided that I was given the mandate and the space to do so. And I think I wouldn't necessarily say that's the template on how to do conflict analysis or political economy analysis. It very much depends on the context, on the mandate you're given, on the context you find yourselves in. And also, we did it in a way that was, we didn't use any of the nice, juicy, I'm sure, political reporting that the UK Embassy collects that is classified in that process, because I was involved as an external facilitator, also because you had national staff involved in it. Would that have come to a slightly different process, an outcome at the end? I'm not sure, but I think each process of analysis you have to gauge what is the best way of doing it. What I also wanted to achieve with that process, which was agreed, was very much that you had a joint shared analysis from some quite different communities within the embassy, and that this could be defended back at headquarters as well, and that they would all three feel ownership of implementing it together. And so that's why it was inclusive. And then also the civil society engagement, which civil society stroke expert engagement, well, I think that's also good practice if you can swing it, even if it is sensitive. And there are ways of managing it to get that local level input and insight, which is of a different quality and nature than you get if you just have an internal process, even with local staff inside an embassy. But it was designed for a particular process at a particular time as a particular donor. So I wouldn't say it's a template at all. You have to navigate each context as it comes.
I would say let's move on to the next case, but if you still have questions in relation to the earlier slides or the Bosnia case that was presented, please write them up, send them, we'll get back to them.
Okay.
And in response to this last question that we were dealing with, please, if you have complementary question. Yeah, it was related to the example of Bosnia, yes. Andrew, there's just a new one coming in.
Yeah. Do I suggest regular revisions to conflict analysis or political economy analysis? Absolutely. I think this idea that you do a conflict analysis and then you're good for 3 years, or you do a political economy analysis and you're good to 3 years, I think that it needs to be updated, but it should be a baseline. If it's talking about the structural causes of conflict or the foundational political factors, those things don't evolve or change quickly. But some of the positions to the actors might evolve. Some of the proximate causes of conflict may evolve. So it should be a question of updating rather than starting again. But certainly that is good practice. That you did a political economy analysis or conflict analysis 3 years ago, has everything remained the same, is a good question to answer, even in a non-volatile context. If the context is more volatile, then actually you may find that things may not have changed as much as you thought by looking at the conflict analysis and say, well, actually, many of the main dynamics of conflict have not evolved. We've just had a significant upstage in violence, but actually those those foundational factors or those conflict factors remain the same. Or we've just had a change in government, but actually the network of patronage, the network of rent seeking, in terms of more political economy analysis, have remained primarily the same. So it is good to update it, but a good conflict or political economy analysis should have some fairly good foundational factors that require updating rather than having to start again.
Yes. Also consider doing in between a lighter one, just to check on a number of issues from the earlier conflict analysis, as part of a monitoring exercise, or decide also whether there are pertinent changes in a context, looking at it from an outset, maybe a coup d'etat or a particular change of situation because environmental catastrophe happened and whatever can change. So be also flexible in your own in your own approach. But as a principle, this regularity should be not only just for conflict analysis, in principle also for political economy analysis.
Yeah. But as I said, I mean, I think some of the foundational factors and the structural factors should not evolve that much unless new information comes to light.
Now, is there in response to this question, is there a rule of thumb that you say, if things do not change too dramatically, do it once in so much time? Is there kind of a very, very broad approximate guidance? I mean, just looking at your practice.
In my experience, I would love to say you should redo it every 6 months, or look at it every 6 months. I think that's probably unrealistic. I think this also has to be built against the realities that donor agencies have.
Yeah.
I think, I mean, to me, to go to an example, tangible example I know, a lot of donors had conflict analyses in Kenya prior to the 2008 crisis and had to rapidly redo them after the crisis in 2008. I think in somewhere like Syria at the moment, just keeping on top of conflict dynamics, Syria or Libya in hot conflicts can change. In terms of political economy analysis, changes of government by whatever means or methods are usually a good point to say, have things really changed or not?
But, and here I come with a big but, looking back at 2012 in Mali, where everybody thought prior to 2012, well, things are going smooth, things are going fine, and then suddenly the big bang. And this also shows, be very, very alert to situations that seemingly are okay. Not only follow the guide, make a conflict analysis if there are obvious some particular changes that need to have further study or understanding. Try to keep up to date.
Yeah, I think Mali 2012 is a good example of where I would say I would be quite critical of the donor community, which really wanted a good news story and wasn't looking at the more foundational factors. It wasn't asking critical questions. It wasn't doing the analysis. That is a case, or if it was being a bit suppressed. I think there were some analyses out there that said, not all is going well here, and to sort of counter some of those things, the analysis, can help you, or should be able to help you. It may not help you predict things, but it may help you to be less surprised when things actually do change. Yeah. So that I would say that
watch out that you are not put on the wrong track.
Yeah. And also in pretty much any developing country context, you need to have either political economy analysis or conflict analysis within the last couple of years. And if you don't, you may well be caught out. I have had another thing there, which was another example, which is a political economy analysis that was done in a country and was extremely critical of the government and of really the modes of behavior the donor had chosen for the government. And I spoke to a head of office in that who very much agreed with the analysis, but said the political moment, not in the country, but back home in the donor headquarters, was not right to enact the kind of radical change that this analysis would call for in terms of funding modalities used, priority sectors of engagement. So their approach was, I keep this analysis in the drawer, and then when the political moment moves on in the headquarters concern, where there is perhaps a new development minister, I will pull the analysis out, or if something does go badly wrong in the context, and say, okay, we have a bit of a strategy now on how to redirect and re-engage based on analysis. And that was their strategy on how to deal with analysis that was politically inconvenient at the time, was not to throw it away, but to put it for a time when they could use it more readily, when the political circumstances actually in their own donor country changed.
We have some 20 minutes more. I would propose that we move on to the Nigeria case.
Yes, I will do this very quickly. So, yeah, this is essentially was a very light touch, one-day conflict analysis session back in 2012. Maybe some of the people from the EC or the EAS were actually involved or aware of this. This was at the start. I think both the European External Action Service and the European Commission have moved on from where they were at the time. But at the time, we didn't even have the framework. The EU framework for conflict analysis wasn't finalised, wasn't agreed. We still had the finding that more conflict analysis should be used. And there was a real interest from one part of the European External Action Service of actually doing a pilot light touch multi-stakeholder conflict analysis at the time. So there was some interest, there was some desire, and then what we had is a deteriorating situation in northern Nigeria and multiple EU stakeholders concerned with northern Nigeria. And we also had an EU funding mechanism to mobilize external expertise, external facilitator, and actually to fly in West African conflict experts through the civil society dialogue network. Again, these are all things that not often occur at the same time in other contexts. And things have moved on a bit in the EU from this moment. But basically, this is more an example to bring up dilemmas and challenges rather than to tell you what the EU is or isn't doing or what is happening or what had happened in northern Nigeria. So essentially, as I understand it, and again, other people may have different opinions on how what actually happened, was there had to be an internal negotiation to undertake this light touch conflict analysis, including with the geographic parts of the European Commission and the European External Action Service. So that had to happen first. Just wasn't the thematic division that focused on conflict prevention and mediation couldn't just go ahead and do the conflict analysis. It had to have buy-in from the geographic section. There was a decision to mobilize the civil society dialogue network for an independent facilitator and for expertise. Now, my understanding is the European External Action Service usually likes to do most of this in-house, doesn't feel the need to mobilize external expertise as much or at all in certain circumstances, because it's built its own capacity. At the time, it didn't have so much capacity. There was also some discussions were had on the parameters approach and a decision to have really a one-day facilitated seminars with multiple stakeholders and external experts. So that was a choice that was made in terms of how are we going to go about this light touch conflict analysis. Okay, we're going to bring EU stakeholders and external experts together in a room for a day and do this analysis. Again, other models are available. That was the choice here. There was a negotiation on, well, who should be invited, who should be in the room, both the external people and the internal people, to ensure maximum buy-in and the relevant stakeholders. Should we, the EU delegation in Nigeria wanted to fly in. So that was a negotiation that was done. Some names were put forward by the Civil Society Dialogue Network of experts who focused on conflict in the region. And then, interestingly, what was done before the process, because we knew it was going to be so light touch and one day, we did analysis of existing political economy analysis and conflict analysis that I would say are relevant for northern Nigeria. Some of them were all of Nigeria focused, West Africa focused. Some of them were focused on very specific areas of governance, those kind of issues. But we did a quick overview analysis of those that was then shared with all the potential participants to show you what is out there already. Then we refined the framework for analysis. Again, the framework is similar to the one currently used by the EU, similar to the ones that's been inspired by others, to basically have a framework that we would use on the day. We renamed it a conflict risk assessment. Why did we rename it a conflict risk assessment? Because at the time there was a necessity to talk about risk and managing risk, and that was felt would get more buy-in than just a conflict assessment. So there was some renaming of that to get more stakeholders involved. I think that rhetorical repackaging to get buy-in, I don't have a problem with. I know other people sometimes want to be more purist on that. We had a pre-meeting with the external experts before the main meeting just to really tell them about the whole process, bring them up to speed with some of the more arcane elements of EU language and EU institutional architecture, and to set their expectations, which I think also helped sort of clarify what was, without limiting their role, why they were being invited, what were the potential pressure points, to get their perspectives beforehand, that I think helped set a nice tone. The analysis event was actually opened by a senior EU official who kind of set the tone for the day, saying that this was for people to think out of the box. People shouldn't be falling back on institutional positions. We're here to listen. We're here to learn from external expertise and put our own stuff on the agenda, that it was an experiment, that it was a trial run, that no one would be held to the analysis and whatever came out of it at the start. And that really sort of set the tone for the day. I think some of the people would have been more perhaps defensive if that tone wasn't there, or perhaps would have felt the need to aggressively defend their institutional positions rather than engage in a process of analysis. It was a participatory analysis against an agreed framework. So we had an agreed framework and a facilitator and 40 participants from across the EU institutions and from West Africa. It was quite a challenge to manage that number of people in a room who all have something to say on conflict dynamics and to feed that into a framework for analysis.
How long did it take?
I think it went from sort of 9:30 till about 4. Yeah, with different sessions focusing on different things and trying to get towards prioritization at the end. The analysis was written up and with recommendations and shared within the EU, and also informally I heard, I'm not an EU official, but that there was memos written on what could be the potential follow-up, while at the same time it was still quite gentle and wasn't saying the EU will do this and this and to follow up. It was more it would take it on board. And looking at what the EU is doing in Nigeria since then, either there's a lot of groupthink going on, or some of the analysis did have somewhat of an input into those discussions. Did have, maybe it had a minor influence, maybe it had a bigger influence. I think it's very difficult for an outsider to say, and even insiders may have their views on it. It's a model that is not necessarily used now. Again, if there's anyone from the EU who can correct me on that, in terms of having such a large event with so many external stakeholders, externally facilitated, it's more a model now used where there are specialists from within the unit it's changed its name, but was the sort of the conflict unit within the External Action Service, who offer facilitation in conflict analysis to various geographic locations that want it. There is talk now, though, about using more conflict analysis, including in joint programming with other EU member states. It's still seen as the heart of the EU's conflict-sensitive approaches. There is a training session that looks at context analysis run by the EU that focuses at different tools, including conflict analysis, that ECDPM is part of running, that trains people in various analytical tools. And there is a more, I think the European Commission, the Development Cooperation part of the European Commission also has more operational guidance on how to do both political economy analysis and some of the conflict-sensitive approaches work as well. So there is a range of tools, and I wouldn't like to say this is not an indication of what's happened now, and it was something that I was personally involved in, so I can speak to, but obviously it is more my personal reflection on what happened, why it happened, rather than a detailed analysis of what's going on now with conflict analysis and political economy analysis within the EU institutions.
Okay.
I think we'll just skip over this part, which is really what came out of the Nigeria conflict analysis, because we've got limited time, and I think I would rather focus on the dilemmas that are sort of more cross-cutting. So I will essentially move on. Well, we can have a question and answer on that example, but if anyone else has anything to say on that, and if there's people from the EU institutions here, I would love to hear how things are going now, but or what they think of that example. If not, I'll move on within the limited time to explore the cross-cutting dilemmas.
Yeah. Well, the more this thinking also sinks into an organization, the more capacity and also preparedness there is to have smaller sessions, to have shorter updates within the house, to look at the development of certain political, economic, but also conflict-related developments. And then the need for such a wider consultation is less. Though it could be, of course, very relevant as part of an organizational process to organize those from time to time more explicitly, to have also fresh thoughts from outside coming in. So this is also a little bit a challenge in doing these analysis to make sure that the diversity of views are sufficiently getting into the institutional context. We do not have a question now, so let's reflect some of these dilemmas and trade-offs you mentioned.
Yeah, the first one I will talk about on the key dilemmas is how important is influential champions for actually the use of analysis. And as I said before, I think having champions who are of a sufficient level to make things happen is really essential. And we know that not only from conflict analysis, but also political economy analysis. So looking for champions within your institution is in my mind really important.
Let me add to this also that, and you had your consultations with civil society in Bosnia, or flew in also certain people from Nigeria
West
for the
Africa,
second one, from West Africa. Look also there who has real also influence to see to what extent some of the results of this analysis can also be taken forward, because sometimes it's also a way of working that you go better indirectly in pursuing certain issues than necessarily only through your own structure or through your own organization. So it's a generic issue, but not only look within your own court, but also look outside.
Yeah. We have limited time left, so I'm going to run through some of these, the rest of these quite quickly, which is another dilemma I have is how much prior consultation is necessary, rather than just going and launching a conflict analysis or a political economy analysis, how much do you need to talk and engage and see where the demand is, see where the pressure points are or the bear traps that might be there in doing the analysis. And I would say that even before you launch the analysis, a significant amount of homework is done, necessary. You need to talk to the people who are going to use and follow up the analysis, find out what the buy-in is and the interest is to do that. How much existing analysis before launching the process? Again, as I said earlier, I think if there are existing analyses out there, use them, build on them, and don't start from zero. There are some things to watch out with that. There is some groupthink, I think, amongst donors. There is some groupthink in conflict analysis. There is some building analysis on the same thought. So don't be afraid to challenge that analysis. I think that's healthy. And I think some people say that there are some blind spots, both in political economy analysis and conflict analysis, when done by outsiders, that perhaps just basing it on existing publicly available analysis done by other donors is perhaps not really enough. You need to look at other maybe academic or commercial analyses or analyses from local commentators and researchers and think tanks as well, that may not be called conflict analysis or political economy analysis, but may really have a lot of the elements of it. The next one is how to balance the rigor. I mean, to me, in both processes that I was just to talk to you, both the Bosnia process and the Northern Nigeria process, as a social scientist, I have significant problems with the fact that they maybe were a bit too light touch, and therefore we are basing decisions on incomplete or potentially bias, and that leads to the next one of people, because all people come with their own biases, and a certain extent of that is unavoidable. But if you have people who come from a military background in a room, or people who are water specialists in a room, or people who have worked on the education sector, or people who lived in the country for 15 years, or who have just arrived last week, you may get a slightly different perspective and a bias in terms of the information that they can put into a process of political economy or conflict analysis. And you have to be aware of that if you are leading the process, and seek to compensate and deal with that. And also challenge people on promoting also their own vested interest, even within donor agencies. Often people want the analysis to go in certain directions because they think it will lead to certain priorities or certain resources, both internal and external ones. And so it's more of a question of being aware of that and how you can do it. The next question is, in both of the processes I did, you had to build capacity to what is this strange thing called conflict analysis. And I'm sure it would have been the same if it was political economy analysis. The people who were involved in the analysis were not aware of the terminology, were not aware of the frameworks. So you had to build their capacity on what this is and do the analysis and have them feed into the analysis at the same time. Now, there are lots of generic courses out there being run, but that also is not an easy thing to do.
Well, it means also in terms of planning your whole exercise, you need to set time apart to take account of this. Yeah.
I think it's how to plug into political strategy and programming processes of real change. I think no one wants to be involved in an analysis that sits on a shelf and doesn't change anything. And it's a question of, well, how does this plug into whatever existing processes are going on inside your donor agency concerned? How does this relate to strategic planning processes, programming processes, revisions of country strategies, diplomatic processes, diplomatic visits, dialogue with other donors? How does this fit into processes of potential change? And it's sort of having a brief mapping of those and how it's relevant also may help sell that and see what the level of ambition is for the analysis.
Let me just add that timing is incredibly important in this regard. When to plug in, at which particular moment. One example has been a political economy analysis that ECDPM colleagues did in Senegal. It was at the time of the elections. It was at the time of a new incoming government, and there the political economy was also in public, the result. So it was a moment really to use. 4 years later, such a thing wouldn't have been possible at all with the same government. So keep in mind that there are particular moments, and also try to anticipate these moments so that you have the preparatory time needed to be there on time with your products to also make an impact.
Yeah. I was an external facilitator in both instances. In both instances, I knew conflict analysis, and I knew the UK well, and I knew the EU well. And I think that really helped me, because I think it's difficult just to bring in a conflict analysis expert or a political economy analysis expert who doesn't have an understanding of the pressure points inside the donor agency and their ways of working and their formats. And therefore, it's often best to use internal people, I have to say. Internal people who understand conflict analysis, but also have a sensitive touch with where the organization is really a good way to go. Sometimes expert facilitators are good. I also think it's not necessarily to be, you're trying to find someone who's an expert on conflict analysis or political economy analysis and the donor agency and Northern Nigeria. Well, good luck in finding someone who's also a regional specialist as well. And be in mind that regional specialists also have their biases as well. They may be able to do things quicker, particularly if it's a process of actual analysis that isn't a facilitated process, but actually going out and interviewing people and doing the research. Maybe more important to get someone who is a real expert from the region. So there's pros and cons of using external facilitators, and again, I wouldn't say yes or no. It's up for you to judge whether that is there. The pool of people who know this and know your organization may be quite small. And then finally, just before we finish, or we should have finished already 2 minutes ago, both these processes I've explained are quite multi-stakeholder. There may be good reasons to make them significantly more, have a more limited number of participants, a less diverse group of participants. I would say in both processes, the diversity added to the richness of the analysis that would have been perhaps more groupthink if it had just been a more narrow group of people, or more dependent on their own experiences and biases and less rich. But that's just a perspective.
Okay, before we close off, we have 2 additional slides in there, so you can consult this with points, with questions for implementation, but also for policy making. So have a look at it, food for thought. We stop here, and we would like to thank you and hope it was useful to some extent, despite the distance. And good luck in doing conflict analysis or political economy analysis or conflict-sensitive political economy analysis. And please get back to us if you have any further questions based on this webinar. We will try to answer them to the extent possible. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.